All right, everyone. Welcome to HTL 312 and to our first lecture. This course is going to look a little different from many of your previous histotechnology classes. Up to this point, you've spent a lot of time learning how to do things correctly, like fixation, processing, staining, troubleshooting artifacts, and producing high-quality slides. Now we're going to talk about something equally important, but often less visible: how we make professional decisions in the laboratory. Because here's the reality: histotechnologists don't just perform technical tasks. Every decision we make carries ethical weight, even when it doesn't feel dramatic. This lecture introduces why ethics matters specifically in laboratory medicine, where we rarely meet patients face to face, yet our work directly influences diagnosis, treatment, and patient outcomes. And yes, before anyone worries, this is not going to be a philosophy class full of abstract debates. We're going to keep this grounded in real laboratory situations you may actually encounter. Think of this course as learning the professional judgment layer that sits on top of your technical skill set. Okay? So let's start with the obvious question. Why are we studying ethics in the histotechnology program? Many people assume ethics applies mostly to physicians or nurses because they interact directly with patients. But laboratory professionals influence healthcare decisions every single day, often quietly and behind the scenes. Let's break this down. First, healthcare decisions affect human lives. Every specimen you process represents a real person waiting for answers. That tissue block isn't just paraffin and cells. It may determine whether someone receives chemotherapy, surgery, or reassurance that everything is okay. Second, laboratory professionals influence diagnosis indirectly. We don't diagnose, but we absolutely shape the diagnostic process. If tissue orientation is wrong, if fixation is inadequate, if a stain is rushed or quality control is skipped, the pathologist's interpretation can be affected. In histology, small technical decisions can create very large clinical consequences. And third, ethical decisions occur daily, often quietly. Most ethical issues are not dramatic headline situations. They're subtle moments like, do I rerun this stain even though we're behind schedule? Do I speak up when something looks off? Do I report an error immediately or hope no one notices? Ethics in the lab rarely looks heroic. It looks like professionalism when no one is watching. And I want to emphasize the note at the bottom here. Histotechs rarely meet patients, but our work directly affects outcomes. You may never shake the patient's hand, but you absolutely impact their care. Before we move forward, let's talk about what you should be able to do by the end of today's lecture. These are not just academic goals, they're professional skills you'll carry into clinical practice. First, you'll learn to define ethics and morality. We're going to clarify what those terms actually mean because people often use them interchangeably, even though they're not identical. Second, you'll distinguish ethics from law, and this is huge in healthcare. Something can be legal but still unethical, and laboratory professionals encounter that distinction more often than you might expect. Third, you'll begin understanding ethical decision-making, essentially how professionals reason through difficult situations when there isn't a perfect answer. Fourth, you'll recognize ethical responsibility in laboratory work, not theoretical responsibility, real responsibilities tied to specimen handling, quality assurance, documentation, and communication. And finally, you'll start applying ethical reasoning because ethics only becomes meaningful when it guides action. Think of today as learning the framework, like learning tissue architecture before identifying disease. Once you understand the structure, everything else starts to make sense. Now that we know why ethics matters and what we're aiming to learn, let's start building the foundation by defining what ethics actually is and how professionals use it in decision making. Ethics examines the principles that guide right and wrong behavior in decision making. And notice something important here. Ethics isn't just about rules. It's about how we decide what we should do, especially when the answer isn't obvious. In healthcare, and especially in laboratory medicine, most ethical decisions happen in gray areas, not black and white ones. You're rarely going to encounter a situation where a giant flashing sign says, "Ethical dilemma detected." Instead, it looks like a mislabeled specimen you notice right before sign out, a questionable quality control result, pressure to rush a block because someone is waiting on a diagnosis. Ethics focuses on conduct and motives, not just outcomes. And this matters for histotechnologists because our work is largely invisible to patients, but absolutely critical to their care. The pathologist's interpretation is only as reliable as the tissue preparation behind it. So ethics becomes the internal compass guiding decisions when policies don't fully answer the question. Think of ethics as the professional version of asking, what is the right action when no one is watching? In histology, small choices matter. Do you re-embed a questionable specimen or hope it's good enough? Do you document an error that slows workflow? Do you speak up when something feels off? Ethics guides action when uncertainty exists, which honestly is a lot of healthcare. A fun reality check? Most ethical problems in laboratories are not dramatic scandals. They're everyday micro decisions. Now we need to separate two words people often use interchangeably, ethics and morality. They are related, but not the same thing. Morality is internal. It comes from personal beliefs, upbringing, culture, religion, and individual values. It's your personal sense of right and wrong. Ethics, especially professional ethics, is external and shared. It comes from professional standards, workplace expectations, healthcare norms, codes of conduct. So morality is your personal compass, while ethics is the professional map everyone agrees to follow together. Here's a lab example for you. Imagine you personally feel uncomfortable handling certain specimen types for moral reasons. Your morality is personal, but your professional ethics require equitable patient care and adherence to laboratory responsibilities. Healthcare professionals constantly navigate this intersection. That's why ethical frameworks exist, not to erase personal beliefs, but to ensure consistent patient care regardless of individual perspectives. In histology labs, ethical tension often shows up as moral discomfort versus professional obligation, personal preference versus standardized protocol, or individual judgment versus patient safety. And here's the key takeaway. Ethical professionalism means recognizing when personal feelings must be balanced with professional responsibility, because ultimately the patient, who we may never meet, depends on consistent ethical practice. Now, this is one of the most important distinctions in healthcare ethics. Ethics and law are not the same thing. The law tells us what we must do. Ethics guides what we should do. Laws are written rules, enforceable, associated with penalties, and they establish minimum acceptable behavior. Think of law as the floor, the baseline requirement. Ethics goes beyond compliance. Ethical standards are often unwritten expectations, professional norms, and guided by integrity and accountability. Ethics is the ceiling, the higher standard we aim for. Let's use your example. Suppose you catch a near miss labeling error before it reaches the pathologist. Legally, you might not be required to report it if no harm occurred, depending on institutional policy. Ethically, reporting it helps identify system weaknesses and prevents future patient harm. Healthcare safety culture depends on ethical transparency, not just legal compliance. Modern laboratories emphasize just culture, meaning we learn from errors rather than hide them. And here's a truth students often find surprising. The biggest threats to patient safety are rarely incompetence, they're silence and fear. Ethical practice encourages speaking up even when it's uncomfortable. Something can absolutely be legal and unethical. History, and unfortunately healthcare, gives us many examples of practices that were legally permitted but ethically unacceptable. So throughout this course, we're not just asking, is this allowed? We're asking, is this the right thing for the patient? Now that we've defined ethics, let's talk about why this actually matters, especially for healthcare professionals. And yes, that absolutely includes histotechnologists. Ethics in healthcare is not theoretical philosophy reserved for courtroom dramas or hospital administrators. It exists because real human beings are affected by every decision made within the healthcare system, including decisions made in the laboratory, often behind the scenes. Let's break this down. First, ethics protects patient welfare. Every specimen you handle represents a person, someone waiting for answers, treatment decisions, or sometimes life-altering diagnoses. Even though we rarely meet patients face to face, our technical decisions directly influence outcomes. Second, ethics builds trust. Healthcare only works because patients trust the system. They trust that their tissue is handled correctly, their identity is protected, and their results are accurate. One ethical failure can damage that trust instantly. Third, ethics supports professional accountability. In the lab, accountability isn't optional. It's embedded into quality control, documentation, validation, and verification processes. Ethics is what motivates us to speak up when something isn't right, even when nobody is watching. And finally, and this is important, ethics guides decisions when policies fail. Because here's a reality check. Policies do not cover every situation. There will be moments when the SOP doesn't quite fit, the answer isn't obvious, or competing priorities exist. Ethics fills that gap. Think of ethics as the clinical judgment layer of professional behavior, similar to how a pathologist interprets morphology when a stain isn't textbook perfect. In histotechnology, we don't just follow procedures, we safeguard diagnostic integrity. And yes, sometimes ethics means doing the harder thing instead of the faster thing, which, as you'll learn, comes up more often than people expect. Now we move into something Posgar introduces early that helps organize ethical thinking, the levels of ethics, because not all ethical decisions happen at the same scale. Microethics focuses on individual decisions and personal interactions. This is where most of your daily lab ethics live. Examples include double-checking a mislabeled cassette, deciding whether to report a near miss, speaking up when fixation looks questionable, and choosing accuracy over speed during a busy shift. These are moment-to-moment professional decisions made by individuals. Microethics is essentially, what should I do right now? And honestly, most ethical stress in laboratory practice happens at this level. Macroethics operates at the systems level. This includes institutional policies, regulatory standards, organizational culture, accreditation requirements, and resource allocation decisions. So when CAP or CLIA or hospital leadership establishes policies about specimen handling or reporting procedures, that's macroethics shaping behavior. Here's the key connection. Macroethics creates the framework. Microethics determines how that framework is lived out daily. In histology terms, macroethics is the protocol. Microethics is how carefully you actually perform the technique. And we all know two people can follow the same protocol very differently. A poorly designed system can create ethical pressure on individuals. For example, unrealistic turnaround expectations, staffing shortages, productivity metrics that unintentionally encourage shortcuts. When systems create ethical tension, that's macroethics influencing microethical decisions. So ethics isn't just about good people versus bad people. Often it's about how environments shape decisions. Now we arrive at one of the most important ideas in ethics, the ethical dilemma. An ethical dilemma occurs when competing values make the correct decision unclear. If a situation feels easy, it's usually not an ethical dilemma, it's just a rule violation. Ethical dilemmas are uncomfortable because multiple important principles collide, and healthcare is full of them. Let's look at the examples listed here through a histotechnology lens. Reporting coworker mistakes. This is a classic lab dilemma. You notice a colleague skipped a processing verification step or mislabeled something, but corrected it before anyone noticed. Now you're balancing loyalty to a coworker, patient safety, professional responsibility, and fear of workplace conflict. Ethically, silence can feel easier, but patient welfare always remains central. And yes, nearly every experienced lab professional encounters this situation at some point. Number two, pressure for faster turnaround. Every lab deals with turnaround expectations. But what happens when speed begins to threaten quality? Do you cut corners slightly, skip a verification step, or assume something is probably fine? Histotechnologists live at the intersection of efficiency and accuracy, and ethical dilemmas often appear exactly there. Remember, tissues don't forgive shortcuts. And lastly, questionable specimen integrity. Maybe fixation was delayed. Maybe tissue arrived compromised. Maybe embedding orientation was uncertain. Do you proceed to keep workflow moving or pause and escalate the concern? Ethical decision-making requires recognizing when technical uncertainty becomes a patient safety issue. So, big takeaway? Ethical dilemmas are not rare events. They are part of professional practice. And here's something students often find surprising. Ethical decisions usually don't feel dramatic. They feel subtle, uncomfortable, and inconvenient. No dramatic music, no courtroom scene, just a quiet moment where you decide what kind of professional you are going to be. And that's exactly why we study ethics, because those moments happen. All right, now we're going to shift gears a little bit. Up to this point, we've talked about what ethics is and why it matters. But now we're going to look at how professionals actually think through ethical problems. Because here's the reality. Ethics in healthcare is rarely black and white. Nobody walks into the lab and says, "Ah, yes, today I will face a clearly labeled ethical dilemma at 10:15 a.m." Instead, ethical issues show up disguised as workflow problems, time pressure, or just this once decisions. So ethical theories are basically frameworks for reasoning. They are mental tools that help us slow down and evaluate decisions instead of reacting automatically. You'll notice we're focusing on three major approaches: consequential ethics, which is focused on outcomes; deontological ethics, which is focused on duties and rules; and virtue ethics, which is focused on professional character. And I want to emphasize something really important here. These are not competing teams. You are not team consequences versus team rules versus team character. In real healthcare practice, professionals almost always use all three, whether they realize it or not. Think of these like different microscope objectives. Low power gives you context. High power gives you detail. Oil immersion gives you precision. None of them are wrong, they just help you see different parts of the same situation. Ethical theories do the same thing. They help you move from, "I feel like this is wrong," to, "I can explain why this decision is ethically justified." And that ability, being able to explain your reasoning, is what separates a technician who follows steps from a professional who exercises judgment. And trust me, someday someone will ask why you delayed a case, repeated a stain, or questioned a specimen. Because vibes felt off is not an acceptable professional explanation. Ethical frameworks help you articulate your reasoning. Ethical theories don't give answers, they help you ask better questions. This slide right here is probably one of the most important concepts in the entire lecture. because this is how ethical decisions actually happen in healthcare. We call this the ethical decision triangle, and it shows that strong ethical decisions usually consider three perspectives at the same time. Let's walk through them. First, professional character. Those are the virtue ethics. This asks, what would a good healthcare professional do? This is what integrity, honesty, and accountability, the traits we expect from someone trusted with patient care. In histotechnology, nobody is standing behind you watching every step you take at the bench. You often work independently, which means ethics becomes less about supervision and more about character. Do you fix the problem when nobody noticed it? Do you speak up when something feels wrong? That's virtue ethics. Second, rules and duties, which is the deontology. This asks what rules, policies, or professional standards apply. Healthcare runs on standards for a reason. CLIA regulations, accreditation standards, chain of custody procedures, and labeling requirements. These exist because mistakes harm patients. So this perspective says even if breaking a rule might seem helpful in the moment, professionals still have obligations. In lab terms, you cannot skip verification steps just because the surgeon is yelling for slides faster. Policies exist to protect patients, and honestly, to protect you too. And third, the outcomes and consequences, which is the consequential ethics. This asks, what happens because of this decision? Who benefits? Who could be harmed? What are the long-term effects? For example, does repeating a stain delay turnaround time? Yes. Does it prevent a misdiagnosis? Also yes. Now you're weighing outcomes. Why the triangle matters. Here's the big idea. Ethical decisions in healthcare rarely rely on only one perspective. Good decisions happen when you consider your professional character, your obligations, and the consequences. If you rely on only one, you can get into trouble. All rules with no judgment? Dangerous. All outcomes with no standards? Also dangerous. All good intentions without accountability? Definitely dangerous. Healthcare ethics is basically the ultimate group project, and all three perspectives have to show up and do their part. Strong ethical reasoning happens at the intersection of character, duty, and outcomes. Now we're going to zoom in on the first major ethical framework, consequential ethics, also called outcome-based ethics. This approach asks a very straightforward question. What action produces the best overall result? In consequential ethics, the morality of an action depends largely on its consequences. If the outcome improves patient welfare or reduces harm, the action is considered ethically justified. Now, and this is important, students sometimes misunderstand this theory. They hear outcomes matter and think, oh, so the ends justify the means no matter what. Not exactly. Healthcare consequentialism isn't about convenience or speed. It's about patient benefit and harm reduction. Let's put this into a histotechnology example. Imagine you embed a specimen and something looks slightly off. Orientation isn't ideal. Technically, you could send it forward. Slides might still be readable, but you know re-embedding would produce clearer diagnostic sections. So now you're balancing delay in turnaround time versus improved diagnostic accuracy. A consequential ethics perspective asks, which action produces the best outcome for the patient? And in many cases, that means accepting a short delay to prevent a long-term diagnostic problem. Another very real lab example, repeating an IHC stain. Does it slow workflow? Yes. Does it increase reagent cost? Yes. Does it potentially prevent an incorrect diagnosis? Also yes. Consequential ethics prioritizes the outcome that best protects the patient. Why this matters in laboratory medicine? Histotechnologists directly influence diagnostic quality. You may never meet the patient, but your decisions absolutely affect them. Every section quality decision has downstream consequences. pathologist interpretation, treatment planning, surgical decisions, and patient outcomes. So even though we work behind the scenes, our ethical decisions are frontline healthcare decisions. In other words, good enough under the microscope is sometimes ethically not good enough. So remember, when using consequential ethics, ask who benefits, who could be harmed, and what outcome best supports patient care. In healthcare, ethical outcomes are measured not by speed or convenience, but by patient safety and diagnostic accuracy. Now we'll shift from outcome thinking to something very familiar to anyone who has worked in a laboratory: rules and duties. Deontological ethics is duty-based ethics. The word comes from the Greek deon, meaning obligation or duty. In this framework, an action is considered morally right because it follows rules or principles, not because of what happens afterwards. In healthcare, this shows up everywhere. We follow procedures not because they are convenient, but because they are professionally and ethically required. Think about our daily lab reality. You may be under pressure, stat cases piling up, turnaround times being watched, a pathologist waiting. But protocols still matter. Patient identification checks still happen. Fixation requirements still matter. Documentation still matters. Deontology asks one main question: what is my duty as a professional? This theory is strongly influenced by philosopher Immanuel Kant, who argued that ethical actions should be universalized, meaning if everyone did this action, would the system still work? So let's translate that into histotechnology. If everyone skipped verification steps when busy, what would happen? Exactly. Diagnostic chaos. Another key idea here is that intent matters. Doing the right thing because it is your professional obligation carries ethical weight, even if outcomes aren't perfect. And honestly, this is why accreditation standards exist. NACLS, CAP, CLIA, they are essentially institutionalized deontological ethics. They define professional duties designed to protect patients. Nobody has ever said, "I'm glad they rushed my biopsy and skipped quality checks." Duty protects patients even when no one is watching. Now we move into what I personally think resonates most with healthcare professionals once they've been in the field for a while, and that is virtue ethics. Virtue ethics focuses less on rules or outcomes and more on who you are as a professional. Instead of asking what rule applies or what outcome is best, virtue ethics asks, what would a good healthcare professional do? This framework comes from Aristotle and centers on character, the habits and values that shape our decisions over time. In laboratory medicine, this is huge because much of what we do happens behind the scenes. Patients rarely meet us. There isn't constant supervision, so professionalism becomes internal. Key virtues you see listed here: integrity, honesty, compassion, and respect are not abstract ideas. They show up in very practical moments: admitting when you made a processing mistake, recutting slides you know aren't optimal, even though no one else might notice, treating every specimen like it belongs to someone you care about, because it does. Virtue ethics recognizes something important. Healthcare isn't just technical work, it's moral work. Two histotechnologists may know the exact same technique, but the one guided by professional character consistently makes safer, more patient-centered decisions. A question I often tell students to ask themselves is, would I be comfortable explaining this decision to the patient or their family? If the answer feels uncomfortable, virtue ethics is waving a little red flag. And here's the reality. Your professional reputation in the lab is built far more on character than technical skill alone. Anyone can learn embedding. Not everyone develops professional integrity. Now we bring everything together. In real healthcare practice, we almost never use just one ethical theory. Ethical decision-making is more like using multiple lenses at the same time. This slide shows how professionals integrate all three approaches when facing a real lab situation. Let's walk through this example. A specimen labeling error discovered after processing. Every histotechnologist's stomach just dropped a little, right? Because this is a real-world ethical moment, not just a technical problem. Now watch how each ethical framework helps guide decision-making. For the consequential ethics, we ask, what action minimizes patient harm? Maybe that means stopping workflow, notifying supervisors immediately, and delaying diagnosis to ensure accuracy. Yes, turnaround times suffer, but patient safety improves. For deontology, now we ask, what do policies and accreditation standards require? Lab SOPs, CAP requirements, and institutional policies typically mandate reporting, documentation, and corrective action. Even if reporting feels uncomfortable, professional duty is clear. And finally, character ethics. This asks what action reflects honesty and professional integrity. This is where personal accountability comes in. Owning mistakes is one of the strongest indicators of professionalism in laboratory medicine. Ethical cultures in labs are built when people feel safe to report errors because integrity is valued over blame. Here's the big takeaway. Strong ethical decisions happen when all three perspectives align. Protect the patient, follow professional duty, and act with integrity. Ethics isn't philosophy floating in space. It's what guides real decisions made by real professionals handling real patient tissue. And honestly, good histotechnologists practice ethics every single day, whether they realize it or not. Now we're getting into what I like to call the ethical backbone of healthcare. Across all healthcare professions, physicians, nurses, laboratorians, histotechnologists, respiratory therapists, we rely on 4 core ethical principles to guide decision making: autonomy, beneficence, non-malfeasance, and justice. And here's something important for you as future histotechnologists. Even though you may never meet the patient whose tissue you're processing, every slide you touch represents a real human being whose care depends on your work. These principles apply just as much in the histology lab as they do at the bedside. Think of these as your ethical compass when policies don't give you a clear answer, because spoiler alert, policies don't cover everything. A fun but very true lab reality: you will eventually encounter situations where the SOP tells you how to do something, but not necessarily what the right decision is when things go sideways. That's where these principles step in. Instead of asking, what's fastest, we start asking, what best protects the patient? And that shift from task completion to patient impact is what separates a technician from a professional. Start with autonomy, which basically means respecting a patient's right to make decisions about their own health care. Now you might be thinking, Becky, we work in a lab. We don't even talk to patients. And that's exactly why this slide matters. In histotechnology, autonomy shows up indirectly through accurate and trustworthy information. Patients make decisions based on diagnoses. Diagnoses depend on pathology. Pathology depends on specimen quality. Specimen quality depends on you. So yes, autonomy absolutely reaches the histology lab. When we process tissue correctly, label accurately, and report honestly, we are supporting informed medical decisions. If a specimen is mislabeled or poorly processed, the patient isn't actually making an informed decision anymore. They're making a decision based on bad data. And ethically, that's a huge problem. Another real-world layer here: autonomy also recognizes that patients come from different cultural, religious, and social backgrounds. Not everyone approaches healthcare decisions the same way. Your job isn't to judge those decisions. Your job is to ensure that diagnostic information is accurate so patients and providers can make choices aligned with their values. Or said another way, we don't control decisions. We protect the accuracy of the information behind them. Now is beneficence, which means acting in ways that promote patient benefit. This is the do-good principle. In healthcare ethics, beneficence asks, does this action help the patient? Now let's translate that into histotechnology reality. Beneficence doesn't always look dramatic in the lab. Sometimes it looks like small decisions nobody else ever sees. For example, you notice staining looks slightly off. Technically acceptable, could probably pass, but something feels inconsistent. Beneficence is the voice in your head saying, run it again, verify it, make sure. Because accuracy matters more than speed. And yes, this sometimes slows workflow down. But remember, the patient would rather wait an extra hour for a correct diagnosis than receive a fast, wrong one. One of my favorite lab truths? Histotechnologists practice beneficence thousands of times a day through quiet quality decisions. No applause, no patient thank you cards, just professional integrity. Also, beneficence builds trust across the healthcare team. Pathologists trust your slides. Clinicians trust pathology. Patients trust medicine. And that chain of trust starts long before anyone sees a microscope. So far, we've talked about respecting patients' decisions and actively working for patient benefit. Now we're going to look at the flip side, one of the most famous ethical rules in healthcare. First, do no harm. That is non-malfeasance. You've probably heard this summarized as first, do no harm. And honestly, if we had to boil laboratory ethics down to one sentence, this would be a strong contender. Now, here's something important for histotechnologists. We rarely interact directly with patients, but our decisions absolutely affect them. A misidentified specimen, a rushed embedding step, a slide labeled incorrectly, those aren't just technical errors, they can become clinical harm. So in the lab, non-malfeasance often looks like prevention. Not dramatic hero moments, just consistent, careful practice. What does do no harm look like in histotechnology? Well, double-checking specimen identifiers before processing, slowing down when workload pressure increases, refusing shortcuts that compromise tissue integrity. And yes, sometimes doing no harm means taking longer, even when turnaround time pressure is real. Fun lab truth? The fastest way to finish a case is almost never the fastest way to fix a mistake later. A specimen mix-up doesn't just delay diagnosis, it can lead to incorrect treatment, repeat procedures, or missed disease entirely. So non-malfeasance asks us, am I preventing harm even when no one is watching? Because ethical practice in the lab is mostly invisible until something goes wrong. Next is justice, and this one is incredibly relevant in modern healthcare systems. Justice means fair and equitable care, not equal effort, but equitable treatment based on medical need. Now let's translate that into laboratory workflow. In the histology lab, justice shows up in how we prioritize work. Every specimen belongs to a real person waiting for answers. Not a VIP, not someone more important, not someone louder, just a patient. Justice means specimens are prioritized by clinical urgency, not personal preference. Workflow decisions remain unbiased. Every case receives the same professional standard. And this is harder than it sounds, because humans naturally develop bias, even unintentionally. Maybe you recognize a surgeon's name. Maybe someone calls you asking you to rush this one. Maybe workload stress makes some cases feel less urgent. Justice reminds us the slide doesn't care who the patient is, and neither should our quality standards. Notice on the right side of the slide how healthcare ethics explicitly says certain things must not influence decisions, like wealth, status, personal relationships, or social value judgments. In other words, healthcare ethics rejects the idea that some patients are more deserving than others. In histotechnology terms, every cassette deserves your best embedding. Every slide deserves accurate labeling. Every patient deserves the same diligence. Justice keeps healthcare fair, even behind the scenes. Now this slide pulls everything together. These four principles, autonomy, beneficence, non-malfeasance, and justice, form the foundation of healthcare ethics. And here's the key takeaway. We almost never use just one principle at a time. Real ethical decisions involve balancing them. Let's look at how they interact from a lab perspective. Autonomy. Patients have the right to make informed decisions. Our role? Provide accurate diagnostic information so clinicians and ultimately patients can choose appropriately. No accurate pathology report means no informed decision. Beneficence. Act for the patient's good. In the lab, this might mean recutting questionable sections, requesting additional levels, or communicating concerns to pathology staff, or even going the extra step because accuracy matters. Non-malfeasance is avoid harm. We prevent harm by maintaining quality control, resisting shortcuts, and recognizing when fatigue or workload threatens accuracy. Injustice. Fairness across all patients. Same standards, same care, same diligence, whether it's a biopsy from an outpatient clinic or a complex surgical resection. Here's the big idea I want you to remember. Ethical practice in histotechnology is not separate from technical skill. It is technical skill done responsibly. You are not just producing slides, you are participating in clinical decision making. And even though patients may never know your name, your ethical choices directly influence their outcomes. Or as I like to say, every perfectly cut section is an ethical act because accuracy, care, and consistency protect patients. Before we move on, I want you thinking about this question. When workload pressure arises, which ethical principle becomes hardest to maintain? Because that's where real professional growth happens. Now we move from ethical principles into something much more practical, professional codes of ethics. Because here's the reality. Healthcare cannot function when everyone just tries their best. That would be chaos. Organized, regulated chaos, but chaos nonetheless. Professional codes of ethics exist to create shared expectations across an entire profession. They answer questions like, what does professionalism actually look like? What behaviors are expected of us? And most importantly, what do we do when no one is standing behind us watching? In histotechnology, this matters a lot because much of our work happens independently. You may be embedding at 6 a.m., cutting slides alone, or verifying stains when nobody else is around. And yet, every decision still affects a real patient. So professional codes give us three major things. The first one is professional expectations. They define how we behave as healthcare professionals, not just technically competent workers, but trusted members of a medical team. Number two, shared standards. No matter where you work, hospital, research lab, reference lab, the ethical expectations are consistent. A slide in California should be prepared with the same integrity as one in West Virginia or New York. Number three, accountability. This is the big one. Ethics codes remind us that professionalism isn't about avoiding getting caught. It's about doing the right thing because patient care depends on it. And honestly, in the lab, integrity shows up in tiny moments. Recutting a section you know isn't good enough. Reporting an error immediately. Not signing off on work you didn't personally verify. Nobody gives you a trophy for those things, but patients benefit every single time. That quote at the bottom of the slide really captures it. Healthcare runs on trust, and trust exists because professionals choose integrity even when no one is watching. And yes, the microtome always knows when you're cutting corners. It senses fear and ethical weaknesses. Now let's clear up something, students, and honestly, many professionals mix up all the time. Code of ethics and code of conduct are not the same thing. Think of it this way. Code of ethics equals why. It's values-based. It tells us what is right or wrong, what principles guide decision-making, the professional ideals we strive towards. It explains how we think. The code of conduct equals how. This is rule-based. It tells us what actions are allowed, what policies must be followed, what behavior is required in specific situations. It explains how we act. Here's a lab example. A code of conduct might say, specimens must be labeled with 2 patient identifiers. Very specific rule. Clear compliance requirement. Code of ethics, however, explains why that rule exists. Because misidentification harms patients and violates our professional duty. So ethics drives judgment, conduct drives behavior. Another way to think about it, ethics asks, what is the right thing to do? Conduct says, here is the minimum acceptable behavior. And here's where professionalism really lives. When ethics fills in the gray areas that policies can't possibly cover. Because trust me, policies cannot anticipate every real-world lab situation. You will eventually encounter moments where the procedure manual doesn't fully apply, the situation is messy, and you must rely on professional judgment. That's ethics in action. Healthcare works because professionals hold themselves accountable, not because every action is monitored. Now we bring this home, specifically to you as future histotechnologists. This is the National Society for Histotechnology Code of Ethics, and this is essentially the professional promise of our field. Notice something important right away. The very first emphasis is dignity and integrity. Not speed, not productivity, not turnaround time, integrity. Because histotechnology sits at a really unique point in healthcare. We rarely meet patients, but we directly influence diagnoses. A pathologist cannot diagnose accurately without high-quality slides. And high-quality slides depend on ethical decisions made at every step. Grossing assistance, fixation handling, processing, embedding orientation, sectioning, staining, quality verification. Every one of those steps contains ethical responsibility. Let's highlight a few pieces from this code. Patient welfare comes first. Even though you don't see the patient, every block represents a person waiting for answers. That biopsy isn't just tissue, it's anxiety, family conversations, and treatment decisions. Confidentiality. Yes, even in the lab. Discussing cases casually, sharing identifying information, or posting interesting slides improperly crosses ethical lines quickly. HIPAA isn't just a hospital rule, it's a professional obligation. Integrity and objectivity. This means reporting problems honestly. If a stain fails, we don't hope the pathologist won't notice. We fix it. Because ethical practice protects patients and protects you professionally. Professional growth. Ethics also includes continuing education and improving practice. Translation: learning never stops in this field. Histotechnology evolves constantly. New stains, new molecular methods, digital pathology, and ethical professionals stay competent. Public health responsibility. This reminds us that laboratory medicine supports the health of entire populations, not just individual patients. One accurate diagnosis can influence screening, treatment protocols, and research outcomes. So this code isn't just words on paper. It's essentially saying, being a histotechnologist means accepting responsibility for invisible but incredibly important patient care. And honestly, that's one of the coolest parts of this profession. We may work behind the scenes, but our ethical decisions are frontline medicine. Now we're moving from big ethical ideas into something much more concrete, professional conduct. If the code of ethics tells us what values we believe in, the code of conduct tells us how we actually behave at work on Tuesday at 2:17 p.m. when the processor is behind, 3 stats just arrived, and someone is asking where their slides are. This is where professionalism becomes observable. As ASCP credential holders or future credential holders, ethical behavior isn't optional. When you earn those letters after your name, you're essentially telling the healthcare system, you can trust me with patient care even when no one is directly supervising me. And notice something important here. Almost every bullet point connects directly to laboratory workflow. Let's break a few down in lab language. Accuracy and precision. This isn't just technical skill, it's ethical responsibility. A mislabeled block isn't a small mistake. It can change a diagnosis. Timeliness. Delays in histology delay treatment decisions. That H&E you're cutting might determine whether surgery happens tomorrow. Confidentiality. Just because we don't see patients face to face doesn't mean privacy rules are relaxed. The specimen still belongs to a person, not just an accession number. Professional relationships? Yes, even when someone from surgery calls for the third time asking if the slides are done yet. And here's the key takeaway. Professional conduct is ethics translated into daily habits. Ethics isn't just about dramatic moral dilemmas. It's about doing the right thing consistently when the work feels routine. Because in laboratory medicine, routine work produces life-changing outcomes. Now, this slide is where ethics really becomes real for us as histotechnologists. When people think about healthcare ethics, they often imagine physicians making bedside decisions or nurses discussing treatment options. But laboratory ethics tends to be invisible and yet incredibly powerful. Most clinical decisions are based on laboratory data, which means ethical lapses in the lab ripple outward into patient care whether we see it or not. Let's look at these real ethical risk areas. Data integrity. This means results must reflect reality, not convenience. No adjusting numbers because something looks off. No skipping verification because you're trying to clear a backlog. The slide doesn't care about your workload, but the patient outcome absolutely does. Documentation accuracy. If it wasn't documented, it didn't happen. Incomplete documentation can break chain of custody, invalidate results, or create legal risk. Good documentation protects patients and protects you. Confidentiality. Specimens carry stories, diagnoses, genetic conditions, sometimes devastating news. HIPAA doesn't stop at the lab door. Discussing cases casually in elevators or hallways, that's an ethical breach even if names aren't mentioned. Quality shortcuts? This is the big one. Every lab professional eventually faces pressure. Time pressure, workload pressure, productivity pressure, and ethics shows up when you decide whether to change reagent early, recut a questionable section, or slow down instead of rushing embedding. Shortcut decisions feel small in the moment, but can have enormous downstream consequences. Here's something I want you to remember. In laboratory medicine, ethical practice is often invisible, but its impact is profound. Patients may never know your name, but they live with the consequences of your work. Now let's talk about something incredibly current and honestly pretty exciting, technology and ethics. Histotechnology is changing faster right now than at almost any time in its history. We have automation, AI-assisted diagnostics, digital pathology, and massive amounts of patient data moving electronically. And technology absolutely improves accuracy and efficiency. But, and this is important, technology does not replace ethical judgment. Let's walk through a few examples. Automation. Automated processors and stainers reduce variability, which is fantastic, but automation also creates risk if we stop paying attention. Just because a machine ran overnight doesn't mean the results are automatically correct. Ethical practice means verifying outcomes, not blindly trusting equipment. Machines process tissue, professionals ensure quality. AI diagnostics. AI can help identify patterns and flag abnormalities faster than humans in some situations. But AI doesn't understand context, bias, or clinical nuance. Someone still has to ask, does this result make sense? Does it correlate with morphology? Should we double check? That someone is still a human professional. Digital pathology. Remote viewing increases collaboration and access. Amazing benefits. But it introduces ethical questions about image security, data ownership, and patient privacy. A digital slide is still protected patient information. Data privacy. The more digital healthcare becomes, the more responsibility we carry to safeguard data. One careless screenshot or unsecured login can expose sensitive patient information. And here's the big takeaway from this slide. Technology enhances accuracy, but ethical responsibility remains human. No algorithm replaces professional integrity. Or said another way, AI can suggest a diagnosis, but it cannot take ethical accountability. And spoiler alert, neither can the processor when something goes wrong. Okay, this slide is where ethics officially stops being abstract philosophy and becomes something you actually do in the laboratory. Because here's the truth. Ethical decisions in healthcare rarely announce themselves dramatically. There's no flashing red light that says ethical dilemma detected. Instead, they usually look like workflow problems. A label doesn't match perfectly. A result seems slightly inconsistent. Someone says, just push it through. We're behind. And suddenly, you're making an ethical decision. So this framework gives you a simple mental checklist. And I emphasize simple because when stress goes up, complexity goes out the window. Step 1, identify the problem. What feels off? In histotechnology, this might be questionable specimen identity, incomplete documentation, tissue that doesn't match the clinical history. Your gut feeling matters here. Experienced techs develop what I call microscope intuition. If something feels wrong, pause. Step 2, gather the facts. Before reacting emotionally, collect information. Ask, what actually happened? Who handled the specimen? Is this a documentation issue or a processing issue? Ethics requires accuracy, not assumptions. Step 3, apply ethical principles. Now bring in what we just learned: autonomy, beneficence, non-malfeasance, justice. Ask, could harm occur? Is this fair? Does this protect the patient? Remember, even though we don't see patients, our slides absolutely affect patient outcomes. Step 4, consider consequences. And this is the key. Not just immediate consequences, but downstream consequences. One mislabeled block can lead to wrong diagnosis, unnecessary surgery, delayed treatment. A tiny lab shortcut can become a massive clinical problem. In step 5, choose the justified action. Not the easiest action, not the fastest action, the justified action. And sometimes that means slowing the workflow down, which feels uncomfortable in busy labs, but protects patients. Bottom line, ethical decision making isn't about being perfect. It's about being intentional. Now I want to normalize something for you. Ethics often feels uncomfortable. If ethical decisions always felt easy, we wouldn't need ethics education. This slide highlights why ethical situations are hard. Uncertainty. You may not have complete information. Healthcare rarely gives us perfect clarity. We make decisions with incomplete data all the time. Sound familiar? That's basically pathology in a nutshell. Pressure. Labs run on time constraints, stat cases, backlogs, surgeons waiting, and pressure creates temptation. It's probably fine. That phrase has caused more laboratory errors than almost anything else. Hierarchy. Healthcare has structure. Students, techs, supervisors, pathologists, administration. Sometimes ethical courage means respectively questioning someone above you. And yes, that is uncomfortable, but professionalism includes speaking up for patient safety. Fear of conflict. Nobody enjoys confrontation, especially in tight lab teams, but silence can unintentionally allow harm. Ethical practice sometimes looks like saying, I just want to double check this before we proceed. Notice, that's professional, not confrontational. The quote here about courage is intentional. Ethics requires moral strength, not loud heroics. Just steady professionalism when it matters. And honestly, some of the strongest ethical moments in labs are quiet ones nobody ever notices, except the patient who benefits. Now we zoom out from individual decisions to something bigger, ethical culture. Because ethics isn't just about one good person making good choices. It's about environments that support good choices. Let's talk about what builds ethical laboratory culture. Leadership. People model behavior. If supervisors cut corners, staff learns shortcuts. If leaders prioritize accuracy over speed, safety becomes the norm. Culture flows downhill and fast. Clear values and expectations. Everyone should know accuracy matters, documentation matters, patient safety always comes first. When expectations are unclear, ethics become inconsistent. Communication. Healthy labs allow questions. You should be able to say something doesn't look right without fear. In strong lab cultures, questions are seen as professionalism, not criticism. Accountability. Accountability isn't punishment, it's responsibility. Mistakes should lead to learning, process improvement, prevention, not blame. Blame cultures hide errors. Ethical cultures learn from them. Continuous learning. Healthcare evolves constantly. Digital pathology, automation, AI all introduce new ethical questions. Ethical professionals stay curious and adaptable. Transparency. When decisions are explained, trust grows, and trust is the currency of healthcare. Here's the key takeaway from Chapter 1 of POSCAR. Ethical cultures are not created by policies sitting in binders. They are created by everyday behaviors, how we talk to coworkers, how we handle mistakes, how seriously we treat patient specimens. Every slide you cut contributes to that culture. And honestly, one of the best parts of histotechnology, we may work behind the scenes, but ethical laboratory professionals quietly protect thousands of patients every year. That's powerful work. This slide is where ethics stops being theoretical and becomes very real for us as laboratory professionals. In healthcare, ethics is often associated with physicians or nurses because they interact directly with patients. But here's the truth. Every slide you cut, stain, or verify carries ethical weight. You're responsible for diagnostic accuracy because a poorly processed specimen doesn't just look bad, it can lead to a missed diagnosis. Patient safety. Even though you may never meet the patient whose tissue you're handling. Professional honesty, meaning if something goes wrong, we speak up. Team accountability. Laboratory medicine is never a solo sport. One of the biggest mindset shifts students make when entering the profession is realizing the specimen is not the priority. The patient behind the specimen is. If a block is mislabeled, if staining looks questionable, or if something feels off, ethical practice means slowing down and addressing it, even when the workload is heavy and everyone wants results yesterday. And let's be honest, nobody enjoys admitting mistakes. But ethical labs are not mistake-free labs. They are transparent labs because catching an error early protects patients and protects your professional integrity. Now we move into an area that sometimes makes people nervous, religion and culture in healthcare. But this is incredibly important, especially as healthcare becomes more diverse. But this ethical beliefs don't exist in a vacuum. They are shaped by culture, personal values, religious or spiritual beliefs, and patients often make healthcare decisions based on these frameworks. You may encounter situations where patients decline blood products, request specific handling of remains, have timing or modesty considerations, or interpret illness through spiritual perspectives. Your role is not to evaluate whether those beliefs are correct. Your role is to respond with respect and professionalism. The key message here, and I want this one to stick, is understanding does not equal agreeing. Healthcare professionals provide ethical care by respecting autonomy while still maintaining safety standards. And from a lab perspective, this might show up in ways you don't expect. Autopsy considerations, specimen handling requests, or communication sensitivity. Ethical professionalism means asking respectfully rather than assuming, because assumptions are usually wrong and occasionally spectacularly wrong. So what does all this actually look like in practice? This slide translates ethical theory into daily professional behavior. First, respect patient autonomy, even when beliefs differ from your own. You are going to work with people whose values, lifestyles, or decisions you may not personally share. Ethical professionalism means providing the same standard of care regardless. Second, avoid assumptions or judgment. In laboratory medicine, we often only see a name and accession number. That limited information can unintentionally lead to bias if we fill in gaps ourselves. Third, seek clarification respectfully. If something is unclear, ask. Ethical communication prevents misunderstandings and protects patients. Fourth, follow institutional policies while honoring patient rights. Policies exist to protect both patients and professionals. Ethics often involves balancing institutional rules with human-centered care. And finally, collaboration. Ethical conflicts are rarely solved alone. Pathologists, clinicians, nurses, ethics committees, healthcare decisions are team decisions. Remember, ethical professionalism isn't about having all the answers. It's about responding thoughtfully when situations become complex. Let's pause and pull everything together. First takeaway, ethics guides decisions where rules fall short. Policies tell you what you must do. Ethics helps you decide what you should do when situations aren't clear. And healthcare is full of gray areas. Second, laboratory professionals are ethical decision makers. You are not passive technicians pushing buttons. You are professionals whose decisions directly influence patient outcomes. Every verification, every QC check, every decision to repeat a stain instead of releasing questionable results, those are ethical actions. Third, ethical reasoning is a learned skill. Nobody walks into this profession already knowing how to navigate ethical dilemmas perfectly. You develop it through experience, mentorship, reflection, and sometimes learning from uncomfortable situations. Think of ethics like microscopy skills. At first, everything looks confusing. Over time, patterns emerge, judgment improves, and confidence grows. All right. I like ending this lecture with this image and message. Do what is right, not what is easy, because ethical challenges in healthcare are rarely convenient. Sometimes the ethical choice means slowing workflow, questioning a process, speaking up to someone more senior, or admitting an error. And those moments require courage. In laboratory medicine, much of our work happens behind the scenes. Patients may never know your name, but ethical practice ensures they still benefit from your professionalism. If there is one thing I want to leave you with today, it's this. You are not just learning technical skills in this program. You are developing professional judgment, the ability to make decisions that protect patients even when no one is watching. And honestly, that's what separates a competent histotechnologist from an exceptional one.